The first day of school is always a mix of excitement and nerves, but for Daniel and Claire, it was more than that. It was stepping into the unknown. As the only white students in an all-black school, they knew they would stand out. What they didn't expect, though, was how deeply that difference would affect them. The school bell rang sharply, echoing down the crowded hallways. Daniel clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, his knuckles turning white. Claire walked beside him, her head held high, though her eyes darted nervously at the groups of students staring at them. The whispers started almost immediately, like a ripple in still water, growing louder with every step they took. "Who do they think they are?" someone muttered. "Lost or something?" Another voice chimed in, and it wasn't long before the whispers turned into open stares and even mocking laughter. By lunchtime, it felt as though the entire school had their eyes on them, watching, waiting for something. Daniel and Claire had been transferred to this school after their parents relocated for work. Their family believed in embracing diversity and saw this as an opportunity to experience a new community. But for Daniel and Claire, the reality was harsher than they imagined. Lunch was a minefield. As they walked into the cafeteria, the noise of conversations and laughter seemed to die down, replaced by the sound of scraping chairs and quiet murmurs. The siblings found an empty table in the far corner, hoping to go unnoticed. But that hope was short-lived. "Hey, new kids," a boy called out loudly, his tone laced with mockery. He was tall, with an air of confidence that bordered on intimidation. His friends chuckled as he approached their table. "You lost or something? This isn't your neighborhood." Daniel forced a small smile, trying to diffuse the tension. "We're just here to eat lunch, same as everyone else." The boy raised an eyebrow. "Lunch? In our cafeteria?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You think you belong here?" Claire's face flushed, but she stayed quiet, gripping her sandwich as if it were her lifeline. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to start trouble, but he could feel the weight of every eye in the cafeteria on them. The boy smirked, clearly enjoying their discomfort. "Welcome to our school," he said mockingly before walking away, his laughter echoing in the air. Days turned into weeks, and the bullying didn't let up. It wasn't always overt, sometimes it was subtle, like the way classmates would stop talking the moment Daniel or Claire walked into a room. Other times it was more direct, whispered insults, tripped feet in the hallways, and cruel notes stuffed into their lockers. For Daniel, the worst part wasn't the teasing, it was the isolation. He missed the easy camaraderie of his old friends, the comfort of blending in. Here, he felt like an outsider, every day a battle to prove he was more than the labels people placed on him. Claire, on the other hand, tried to stay strong, burying herself in her schoolwork and pretending the comments didn't sting. But at night, in the quiet of their shared bedroom, she often cried, her tears soaking into her pillow as Daniel sat silently, unsure of how to help. Despite the hostility, the siblings refused to give up. Their parents had always taught them the value of resilience and kindness, even in the face of adversity. "If you want to change the world, start with yourself," their father often said. So, Daniel and Claire decided to do just that. Daniel joined the school's basketball team, hoping to find common ground with his classmates. He wasn't the best player, but he worked hard, showing up early to practice and staying late to improve his skills. Claire, meanwhile, joined the debate club, determined to prove she had a voice worth listening to. At first, their efforts seemed futile. On the basketball court, Daniel often found himself benched, his teammates reluctant to pass him the ball. In the debate club, Claire's ideas were dismissed before she even had a chance to explain them. But slowly, things began to change. One afternoon, during a particularly intense basketball game, Daniel saw an opportunity. The team was down by 2 points with only seconds left on the clock. The ball came his way, and for a moment he hesitated, unsure if his teammates would trust him to take the shot. But then he remembered his father's words and decided to take a chance. He dribbled past two defenders, his heart pounding as he launched the ball toward the hoop. The gym fell silent as everyone watched the ball soar through the air before swishing cleanly through the net. The crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time, Daniel saw something other than disdain in his teammates' eyes: respect. Meanwhile, Claire was making her own strides. During a heated debate competition, she presented a passionate argument that left even the harshest of her critics speechless. Her poise and determination earned her a standing ovation from the audience, and a grudging nod of approval from her fellow debaters. Their victories didn't erase the challenges they faced, but they did start to shift the narrative. Slowly but surely, some of their classmates began to see them not as outsiders but as individuals with strengths and talents worth recognizing. But just as things seemed to be improving, an incident occurred that threatened to undo all their progress. One morning, Daniel and Claire arrived at school to find their lockers defaced with hateful messages. The words were ugly, scrawled in red paint that dripped onto the floor. It was a stark reminder that not everyone was ready to accept them. As they stood there, staring at the graffiti, a group of students gathered around, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. No one spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the basketball players stepped forward. "This isn't right," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "They don't deserve this." Another student chimed in, followed by another, until a small group had formed, united in their support for Daniel and Claire. Together, they helped clean the lockers, scrubbing away the hateful words until only faint traces remained. For the first time since their arrival, Daniel and Claire felt a glimmer of hope. They realized that while prejudice and ignorance still existed, so did compassion and the potential for change. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was a beginning, a chance to show that unity could overcome division. As the bell rang, signaling the start of class, Daniel and Claire walked down the hallway with their heads held high. The journey was far from over, but they knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't let the hate define them. And maybe, just maybe, their resilience would inspire others to look beyond differences and see the shared humanity that bound them all together. As Daniel and Claire settled into their seats in the first class of the day, the weight of what had just happened lingered over them. The words on their lockers, though scrubbed away, were burned into their minds. Around them, a few students cast uncertain glances, as if unsure how to react now that the siblings had found some support. Others avoided looking at them altogether, their silence speaking volumes. The teacher began the lesson, her voice steady as she scribbled notes on the board, but Daniel found it hard to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the locker incident. Who had done it? Why couldn't they just leave him and Claire alone? He glanced at his sister, who was staring straight ahead, her expression carefully blank. He could tell she was putting on a brave face, but he knew her well enough to recognize the tension in her clenched fists. After class, a few students approached them hesitantly. One of them was Mia, a girl from Claire's debate team. She had always seemed kind but had never gone out of her way to talk to them before. "I'm sorry about what happened this morning," Mia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't right." Claire nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Thanks," she said, her tone polite but guarded. Another student, a boy named Jordan from Daniel's basketball team, joined in. "If you ever need help, just let me know," he said awkwardly, scratching the back of his head. It was clear he wasn't used to this kind of conversation. Daniel appreciated the sentiment, even if it felt a little forced. "Thanks, man," he said, offering a small smile. As the day went on, the siblings couldn't help but notice a shift. While the hostility hadn't disappeared entirely, there were moments when the walls seemed to crack, letting in glimpses of understanding and kindness. But just as they began to feel a sliver of hope, the tension in the air grew thicker. By lunchtime, the cafeteria was buzzing with whispers about the locker incident. Some students speculated about who was responsible, while others debated whether Daniel and Claire deserved the backlash they were getting. The siblings sat at their usual table in the corner, trying to tune out the noise. But when a loud voice cut through the chatter, their attention snapped to the source. "It's not about them being different," the boy from the morning confrontation declared, standing on a chair in the middle of the room. "It's about them thinking they can come in here and act like they belong." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the boy. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to disagree. For a moment, no one spoke, and then, to Daniel's surprise, Jordan stood up. "That's enough, Terrence," Jordan said, his voice firm. "They're just trying to go to school, same as the rest of us." Terrence jumped down from the chair, his face twisted with anger. "And you're just gonna defend them? Like they're your friends now?" Jordan didn't back down. "Yeah, I am. Because this isn't about them, it's about us. How we treat people says more about us than it does about them." The cafeteria buzzed with murmurs again, and for the first time, Daniel and Claire saw more faces turning toward them with curiosity rather than hostility. But they knew this moment wouldn't erase the resentment that still lingered beneath the surface. That afternoon, the school principal called an assembly to address the growing tension. As the students filed into the auditorium, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Daniel and Claire sat near the back, trying to stay out of the spotlight. When the principal stepped onto the stage, her expression was a mix of sternness and concern. "I know that recent events have stirred up a lot of emotions," she began, her voice steady but firm. "But this school is a place for learning, for growth, and for respect. What happened this morning was unacceptable, and I want to make it very clear that bullying or targeting anyone for any reason will not be tolerated." The principal's words were met with a mix of applause and silence. Daniel couldn't help but notice that some students looked defiant, while others seemed genuinely moved. But as much as he wanted to believe things would change, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. After the assembly, Daniel and Claire found themselves approached by a teacher, Mr. Harris, who taught history. He was known for being fair and level-headed, and his presence was both reassuring and intimidating. "Can I have a word with you too?" he asked, motioning for them to follow him into an empty classroom. Once they were seated, Mr. Harris folded his hands on the desk and looked at them thoughtfully. "I've been a teacher here for a long time," he said. "I've seen students come and go, each bringing their own challenges and perspectives. But I've also seen how easy it is for fear and misunderstanding to take root." Daniel and Claire exchanged a glance, unsure where he was going with this. "What happened to your lockers this morning was wrong," Mr. Harris continued. "But I want you to know that there are people here who see you for who you are, not just what you look like. And I believe you have the strength to rise above this." Claire nodded slowly. "We're trying," she said quietly. Mr. Harris smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. Because this isn't just about you. It's about showing everyone that we're stronger together than we are divided." As they left the classroom, Daniel felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. He appreciated Mr. Harris's support, but he couldn't help but wonder why it had to be so hard to prove they belong. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table with their parents, they recounted the events of the day. Their father listened intently, his expression a mix of pride and concern. Their mother reached across the table to squeeze Claire's hand. "I know it's not easy," their father said. "But you're making a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Change takes time." Daniel and Claire nodded, but the weight of their experiences still hung heavy on their shoulders. They knew they couldn't expect things to change overnight, but they also couldn't ignore the lingering fear that tomorrow might bring more challenges. That night, Daniel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions. Who had defaced their lockers? Why were some students so determined to push them out? And most importantly, how could they ever truly feel at home in a place where they were constantly reminded they didn't belong? As the moonlight streamed through the window, he turned to Claire, who was lying in the bed across the room. "Do you ever think we should have just stayed at our old school?" he asked quietly. Claire turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty he felt. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I think about what Dad always says about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. If we leave, we're letting them win. Daniel nodded, her words giving him a small sense of comfort. But deep down, he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The next morning, as they walked into school, the tension was palpable. Students whispered and glanced their way, some curious, others openly hostile. But Daniel and Claire held their heads high, determined to face whatever challenges came their way. As they approached their lockers, they noticed something different. A small group of students had gathered, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. One of them stepped forward, holding a piece of paper with an apology scrawled across it. "We're sorry," the student said, their voice trembling slightly. "We didn't do it, but we didn't stop it either. And that was wrong." Daniel and Claire exchanged a surprised glance, their hearts pounding with a mix of emotions. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was a small step toward breaking down the walls that had been built around them. But even as they accepted the apology, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the true challenge was still ahead. Trust would take time to rebuild, and there were still those who clung to their prejudice like a shield. The question was, how far were Daniel and Claire willing to go to prove that they belonged? And would their resilience be enough to inspire lasting change in a place that had always been divided? The school felt different in the days that followed, but not entirely in a good way. While some students seemed to soften their attitudes, others grew more aggressive. The apology they had received at their lockers was a small gesture, but it wasn't enough to change the atmosphere entirely. The looks, the whispers, and the occasional snide comments continued, as if some people couldn't stand the idea of Daniel and Claire being accepted. One afternoon, as Daniel made his way to gym class, he noticed a group of students huddled near the entrance to the locker room. Their voices were low, but the tension in their stances was unmistakable. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn around and avoid them, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He straightened his shoulders and walked past them, determined to show he wasn't intimidated. "Hey, Daniel," one of the boys called out, his tone laced with mockery. "Think you're tough, huh?" Daniel ignored him, keeping his eyes forward, but his heart raced. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear their muffled laughter as he entered the locker room. He knew they were waiting for him to react, to give them a reason to escalate things. But he refused to give them that satisfaction. Meanwhile, Claire faced her own challenges. In her literature class, a group project had been assigned, and she had been paired with two students who made no effort to hide their resentment. They barely acknowledged her, speaking only to each other and leaving her out of the discussion. Claire tried to contribute, offering ideas and suggesting tasks, but they either ignored her or dismissed her suggestions with curt responses. By the end of the day, both Daniel and Claire were exhausted. The weight of the constant tension was beginning to take its toll, and they struggled to hold on to the resilience they had clung to so fiercely. As they walked home together, they didn't say much, the silence between them filled with unspoken frustration and fatigue. That evening, their father noticed the change in their demeanor. He sat them down at the kitchen table and listened as they vented their frustrations, their voices filled with anger and hurt. Their father's expression was serious as he spoke. "You're fighting a tough battle," he said. "But remember, battles aren't won in a day. You're planting seeds, even if you can't see them growing yet. Don't lose sight of why you're standing strong." His words offered some comfort, but they didn't erase the pain of the day's events. That night, Daniel lay awake again, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could do to change things. He felt trapped, like no matter how hard he and Claire tried, it would never be enough to break through the hostility that surrounded them. The next day, things took a darker turn. As Daniel and Claire walked into the schoolyard, they noticed a group of students gathered near the flagpole. At first, they didn't think much of it, but as they got closer, they saw what everyone was staring at. Hanging from the pole was a crudely made sign with hateful words scrawled across it, directed squarely at them. Claire froze, her face pale, and Daniel felt a surge of anger so strong it made his hands tremble. The crowd of students stood in uneasy silence, some looking shocked, others smirking or whispering to each other. A teacher quickly rushed over to take the sign down, but the damage had already been done. The principal called another assembly that afternoon, her face stern and her tone unyielding. "This kind of behavior has no place in our school," she said, her voice echoing through the auditorium. "We are investigating this incident thoroughly, and those responsible will face serious consequences." But despite her strong words, Daniel and Claire couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. The sign was a message, loud and clear, that there were still people determined to push them out. As they walked through the halls after the assembly, the stares felt even more piercing, the whispers even louder. That evening, as they sat in their room, Daniel finally voiced the question that had been weighing on him. "What if this never changes?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and doubt. "It has to," she said, though her voice wavered. "It can't stay like this forever." But deep down, they both knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. The question was whether they had the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for a place in a school that seemed determined to push them away. The tension reached its breaking point a few days later. During lunch, as Daniel and Claire sat at their usual table, a commotion erupted across the cafeteria. They turned to see Terence, the boy who had stood on the chair before, standing nose to nose with Jordan. Their voices were raised, and it was clear the argument was about to escalate. "You're just a traitor," Terence spat, his voice filled with venom. "Defending them like they're one of us." Jordan didn't back down. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about them. It's about what kind of people we want to be." The cafeteria fell silent, everyone watching as the confrontation unfolded. Daniel's heart pounded as he realized the fight wasn't just about him and Claire anymore. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond their individual experiences. Terence's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, it seemed like he might throw a punch. But before he could, a teacher stepped in, breaking up the argument and sending both boys to the principal's office. As the cafeteria slowly returned to its usual noise and chaos, Daniel and Claire exchanged a glance. They could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that the battle lines had been drawn more clearly than ever. The question now was whether those lines would divide the school further or pave the way for something new. The cafeteria incident left the school buzzing. Whispers of the confrontation between Terence and Jordan spread like wildfire. Some students sided with Terence, feeling he had voiced what they believed but didn't dare say. Others admired Jordan's courage, seeing his stance as a rare act of integrity. It was clear that the school was fracturing into camps, and the tension was reaching a breaking point. For Daniel and Claire, it felt like standing in the eye of a storm, unsure which way the winds would blow. Later that day, as they walked to their next class, Daniel noticed something unusual. Jordan was leaning against a wall in the hallway, his face tense, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. He looked up as they passed, and for a moment their eyes met. Daniel hesitated, unsure if he should say something, but Jordan gave a small nod before turning and walking away. That brief exchange lingered in Daniel's mind. Jordan had risked a lot by standing up for them, and now it seemed like he was paying the price. It made Daniel feel a mix of gratitude and guilt. He wondered if he and Claire were worth all the trouble they were causing, not just for themselves but for others as well. That afternoon, things took a darker turn. Claire was in science class when her lab partner, a quiet girl who rarely spoke, slipped a folded piece of paper onto her desk. Claire opened it cautiously, her heart sinking as she read the message. It was a warning, scribbled hastily: "Be careful. They're planning something after school." Claire's stomach tightened. She glanced at her partner, who avoided eye contact, her face pale. Claire didn't need to ask who they were. She knew it had to be the group of students who had been targeting her and Daniel since the beginning. When the final bell rang, Claire found Daniel waiting for her by the lockers. She showed him the note, her hands shaking slightly. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read it, his mind racing. He didn't know what something meant, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. "We'll go straight home," Daniel said firmly, his voice low. "No detours." Claire nodded, clutching her backpack tightly as they made their way toward the school's front entrance. The hallways were unusually quiet, the usual chatter and laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As they stepped outside, the cool afternoon air hit them, but it did little to calm their nerves. They walked quickly, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. For a few minutes, it seemed like they might make it out without incident. But then, as they rounded a corner near the edge of the school grounds, they saw them. A group of 5 students stood in their path, their postures aggressive, their faces set in grim determination. Daniel instinctively moved in front of Claire, his heart pounding. He recognized some of them from the group that had mocked him by the locker room days earlier. Their leader, a tall boy with a sneer that could cut glass, stepped forward. "Going somewhere?" the boy said, his tone mocking. "We thought we'd give you a proper send-off." Daniel's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We don't want any trouble," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The boy laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Too late for that," he said. "You brought trouble the moment you showed up here." Before anyone could say more, a voice rang out behind them. "Leave them alone." Daniel and Claire turned to see Jordan walking toward them, his expression hard. He stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. The group of students hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "You really want to do this?" Jordan said, his voice sharp. "Because if you do, you'll have to go through me." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The leader of the group sneered, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. He looked at his friends, as if seeking their support, but none of them stepped forward. "This isn't over," the boy said finally, his voice low. He gave Daniel and Claire one last glare before turning and walking away, his group trailing behind him. Jordan watched them go before turning to Daniel and Claire. "You two okay?" he asked, his tone softer now. Daniel nodded, still processing what had just happened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Thanks to you?" Jordan shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. "Don't mention it. Just be careful, all right? Not everyone's going to back down that easily." As they walked home together, Daniel and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The confrontation had been a close call, but it also felt like a prelude to something more dangerous. And while they were grateful for Jordan's support, they knew they couldn't rely on him to protect them forever. That night, as they sat at the kitchen table, their father listened intently as they recounted what had happened. His expression was grave, but his voice was calm as he spoke. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "But strength isn't just about standing your ground. Sometimes it's about knowing when to seek help." The next morning, Daniel and Claire walked into school with their heads held high, determined not to let fear dictate their actions. But as they made their way to class, they noticed something unusual. A large crowd had gathered in the main hallway, their voices hushed but urgent. Pushing through the throng of students, Daniel and Claire saw what everyone was looking at. A message had been scrawled across the lockers in bold, red letters. It wasn't just hateful, it was a direct threat. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, her mind racing. This wasn't just bullying anymore. It was something far more sinister. As teachers rushed to clear the hallway and remove the graffiti, Daniel and Claire exchanged a glance. They knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. The threatening message on the lockers hung in the air like a storm cloud. The principal called an emergency assembly that morning, addressing the entire school in a tone that demanded attention. He condemned the act and promised consequences for those responsible. But as Daniel and Claire sat in the auditorium, they couldn't shake the feeling that words alone wouldn't solve anything. The divide in the school had grown too deep, and the air was thick with tension. Later that day, Jordan found them near the library. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with a sense of urgency. He pulled them aside, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I heard something," he said quietly. "The same group is planning to corner you both after school again. They think the principal's talk was just for show and that no one's going to stop them." Daniel's chest tightened, and he felt Claire grip his arm. The fear was real, but so was the resolve building inside him. He was tired of running, tired of being afraid. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Jordan hesitated before answering. "Meet me by the basketball court after school. I'll make sure you're not alone." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every glance from a fellow student felt like a threat, every whisper like a warning. When the final bell rang, Daniel and Claire made their way to the basketball court with their hearts pounding. Jordan was already there, along with a surprising sight several other students, some of whom they barely knew. They stood together, arms crossed, their faces set with determination. "We're not letting them get away with this," one of the students said. "Enough is enough." Before Daniel could process what was happening, the group from the previous day appeared, their leader at the front. They stopped short when they saw the crowd waiting for them. For a moment, no one moved. The air was electric, charged with anticipation. The leader stepped forward, his sneer faltering slightly as he sized up the situation. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, his voice laced with disdain. "You think you're tough now because you've got backup?" Jordan stepped forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "This isn't about being tough," he said. "It's about doing what's right. You've had your fun, but it ends here." The leader looked around at his group, clearly trying to gauge their support. But something had shifted. The crowd behind Daniel and Claire wasn't just standing up for them, it was standing against the fear and hate that had been allowed to fester for too long. Even some of the leader's own friends seemed hesitant, their expressions unsure. Realizing he was losing his grip, the leader turned his attention back to Daniel. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice quieter but no less venomous. "You never will." Daniel took a step forward, his fear melting away in the face of his growing resolve. "We belong here just as much as anyone else," he said firmly. "And we're not going anywhere." For a moment, it seemed like the leader might lash out, but then something unexpected happened. One of his friends stepped back, shaking his head. "I'm done with this," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned and walked away, leaving the others standing awkwardly in his wake. Out one by one, the rest of the group followed, until only the leader was left. He looked around, his confidence crumbling, before finally turning and walking away without another word. The tension in the air dissolved, replaced by a sense of relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. The students who had come to support Daniel and Claire cheered, their voices echoing across the school grounds. Claire turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, hope. But just as they thought the worst was over, the unexpected twist came. As they began to disperse, a teacher appeared, looking serious. She had overheard the confrontation and called the principal. Within minutes, the students who had stood against the bullying were called into the office not to be punished, but to give statements. It turned out that the administration had been quietly gathering evidence, trying to identify the instigators of the bullying without escalating the situation. The bravery of the students who had stood up that day gave the school the final push it needed to take decisive action. The students who had been responsible for the threats and harassment faced disciplinary measures, and the school implemented new programs to foster unity and understanding among its students. In the days that followed, things began to change. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but the act of standing together had sparked something in the school. People started talking, sharing their stories, and finding common ground where they hadn't thought it existed before. For Daniel and Claire, life didn't become magically easy, but it became bearable. They found friends in places they never expected and discovered a strength within themselves they hadn't known they possessed. And as they walked through the school halls, no longer avoiding eye contact or hiding in the shadows, they knew they had earned their place not just in the school, but in the story of what it could become. What began as an ordeal they wouldn't wish on anyone became a lesson in resilience, courage, and the power of standing together. And though they would always remember the pain of those early days, they would remember the victory even more. The school wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. In the weeks following the confrontation, the school felt like an entirely different place. Daniel and Claire, once isolated and unsure of their future there, found themselves surrounded by classmates who had grown curious about them. It started with small things, someone asking to sit with them at lunch, a passing smile in the hallway, but those small gestures began to snowball into something bigger. Jordan remained a constant, his quiet strength serving as a reminder of how one person's kindness could spark change. He introduced Daniel and Claire to his friends, creating a circle of people who supported one another in ways they hadn't thought possible before. The three of them became inseparable, their bond forged in the fire of what they had endured together. The principal followed through on his promise to address the bullying head-on. Meetings were held with parents, and new initiatives were introduced, including open forums where students could share their experiences. At first, there was hesitation. Few people wanted to speak up in a room full of strangers. But once someone did, the floodgates opened. Stories poured out, some of them surprising, others heartbreaking. It became clear that Daniel and Claire weren't the only ones who had felt out of place or mistreated. The most striking moment came when one of the boys from the group that had targeted Daniel and Claire stood up during one of these forums. His voice trembled as he apologized not just to them but to anyone he'd hurt with his actions. He explained that he had followed the crowd out of fear of becoming a target himself. His words didn't erase the harm he'd caused, but they started a conversation about how fear and ignorance could lead people down the wrong path. Daniel and Claire, hesitant at first, slowly began to open up about their own experiences. They spoke about the pain of feeling invisible and the strength it took to stand up for themselves. Their words resonated with students who had never considered what it might feel like to be in their shoes. These conversations, while sometimes uncomfortable, brought a sense of understanding that had been missing for far too long. At home, Daniel and Claire's parents noticed the changes, too. The kids who had once come home tense and withdrawn were now laughing at the dinner table, sharing stories of their day. Their parents listened with a mix of pride and relief, grateful that their children had found a way to rise above the challenges they'd faced. As the school year went on, Daniel and Claire's confidence grew. They joined clubs and even volunteered for group projects in class, things they would have avoided just months earlier. Claire discovered a love for art, while Daniel threw himself into basketball, finding solace and camaraderie on the court. The team became another source of support, with teammates rallying around him both on and off the court. The school, while still far from perfect, was undeniably better. New traditions began to take root, like cultural exchange days where students shared their backgrounds and histories with one another. These events became some of the most anticipated days of the year, transforming the school into a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. Jordan, ever the quiet hero, stood back and watched the change unfold. He didn't seek recognition for his role in it all, but Daniel and Claire never let him forget how much he'd meant to them. On the last day of school, the three of them sat on the steps outside, watching as students filed out with yearbooks and summer plans in hand. There was a sense of closure in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd all come. "You know," Claire said, breaking the silence, "I used to hate this place. I'd count down the days until I could leave." Daniel nodded. "Me too. But now," He glanced around at the familiar faces, some of whom had become friends, others who had simply stopped being enemies. Now, it feels like home. Jordan grinned, leaning back on his elbows. Guess that makes us part of the change, huh? Claire laughed softly, her eyes shining. Yeah. I guess it does. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the three of them sat there, savoring the moment. They didn't need to say much. The silence was filled with the unspoken understanding of what they'd been through and what they'd achieved. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving, about knowing they'd left the school better than they'd found it. When summer came, Daniel and Claire spent their days surrounded by friends, their laughter echoing through parks and backyards. They weren't the same kids who had walked into that school feeling outnumbered and alone. They were stronger, braver, and more sure of who they were. And they carried that strength with them into everything they did, knowing that they had faced the worst and come out the other side. The story of what happened at their school spread beyond its walls. Other schools reached out, asking for advice on how to address similar issues. Teachers and administrators took notes, hoping to replicate the progress that had been made. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, proof that change was possible when people were willing to stand together. Years later, when Daniel and Claire looked back on that time, they didn't dwell on the pain or the fear. They remembered the friendships, the lessons, and the moments that proved they were capable of more than they ever thought possible. They remembered how they turned a place of division into a place of unity, one small act of courage at a time. In the end, the story wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who had decided to step up, to speak out, and to make a difference. It was about how ordinary people, when they came together, could do extraordinary things. And that was the lesson they carried with them, the lesson they hoped others would carry, too.